Hello, Sherlynn McElroy here, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about Charles Dickens, who wrote, as we all know, one of the most famous stories ever written at Christmas time, A Christmas Carol. But what else do we know about Charles Dickens? I think I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. For instance, his full name is Charles John Huffam Dickens, and he was born in 1812 and he died in 1870. He was an English writer and a social critic. Aha! He created some of the world's best-known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. His works enjoyed unprecedented popularity during his lifetime, and by the 20th century, critics and scholars had recognized him as a literary genius. I kind of agree with them. His novels and short stories are widely read today, and here are a few of his most favorites, and you, I'm sure, will recognize some of these. The Pickwick Papers, which is a monthly serial that he wrote. Now, Charles Dickens did a lot of his famous stories as a serial, either monthly or weekly, which I think is quite fascinating, and I hope you find that fascinating too. He didn't just sit down and write the entire story. He wrote it as a serial, as a series in monthly or weekly periodicals. And the Pickwick Papers, he wrote as this monthly serial from 1836 to 1837. Most of these are about a year that he did this. Then there's Oliver Twist, which is a fun one. And he wrote that as a monthly serial from 1837 to 1839. 2 years. I think that was his longest serial that he ever did. A Christmas Carol, of course, and he wrote that in 1843. It wasn't a serial, so that's something. David Copperfield, and he did that as a monthly serial from 1849 to 1850. And a little FYI on David Copperfield, he never intended to publish that. A Tale of Two Cities, which I had to read in high school, as I'm sure a lot of you had to read A Tale of Two Cities somewhere along in your education. And he wrote that as a weekly serial from 1849 to 1850. And then, Great Expectations. I, for one, did not have to read that in high school. I don't know if that was a sad thing or a lucky thing. A lot of my friends in their history classes had to read Great Expectations. I, for one, did not. Dickens edited a weekly journal for 20 years. He wrote 15 novels, 5 novellas, hundreds of short stories, and nonfiction articles. He lectured and performed readings extensively and was an indefatigable letter writer and campaigned vigorously for children's rights, for education, hooray, and for other social reforms. My goodness, that is wonderful so far. Now here's a little bit about his characters. Dickens' biographer, Claire Tomalin, regards him as the greatest creator of character in English fiction, after, of course, Shakespeare. Dickensian characters are amongst the most memorable in English literature, especially so because of their typically whimsical names. For instance, Ebenezer Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Jacob Marley, and Bob Cratchit. Of course, we all know those characters from A Christmas Carol. Then there's Oliver Twist, the Artful Dodger, Fagin. My favorite of Oliver Twist is Fagin. and Bill Sikes. Then, that is, of course, from Oliver Twist. And then you have Pip, Miss Havisham, and Abel Magwitch from Great Expectations. Then you have Sidney Carton, Charles Darnay, and Madame Defarge from A Tale of Two Cities. And lastly, David Copperfield, Uriah Heep, and Mr. Micawber from David Copperfield. Interesting names. At a time when Britain was the major economic and political power of the world, Dickens highlighted the life of the forgotten poor and disadvantaged within society. Through his journalism, he campaigned on specific issues, such as sanitation and the workhouse. But his fiction probably demonstrated its greatest prowess in changing public opinion in regard to class inequalities. He often depicted the exploitation and oppression of the poor and condemned the public officials and institutions that not only allowed such abuse to exist, but flourished as a result of that. His writings inspired others, in particular journalists and political figures, to address such problems of class oppression. For example, the prison scenes in the Pickwick Papers are claimed to have been influential in having the Fleet prison shut down. Karl Marx asserted that Dickens, quote, "issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together." End quote. Dickens was the most popular novelist of his time and remains one of the best known and most read of English authors. His works have never gone out of print and have been adapted continually for the screen since the invention of cinema, with at least 200 motion pictures and TV adaptations based on Dickens' works documented. Many of his works were adapted for the stage during his own lifetime. And that's just a little bit of backstory about Charles John Huffam Dickens. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Charles Dickens' life. And so, until we meet again, I bid you good day.